Is it just me who feels like the Krasue's release felt like a million years ago? With the Stranger Things 2 PTB here, the Sinister Grace chapter is already in the rearview mirror, but it's like that scene in Jurassic Park. Objects in that mirror are closer than they appear. September the 23rd, the release date for Sinister Grace is less than 4 months ago, but it feels so much longer, and part of that is the unusually long time between releases caused by the various delays. To make room for the extra quality of life features that we only sort of got, Sinister Grace was delayed. The mid-chapter was spaced out further from the chapter's release, and that pushed Stranger Things on the other side of Behaviour's Christmas break, meaning the Sinister Grace chapter period was inherently longer than most release cycles, and it was also the only mid-chapter 2025 that didn't bring either a new character or a rework so comprehensive it may as well have been a new character. But even taking the prolonged waiting period into account, I don't think I've ever seen a killer fall off as hard between a chapter release and the next one as the Krasue. When was the last time any of you saw a Krasue in your Survivor matches? I'm willing to bet it's been a little while, and if you ever did see a lot of Krasues, they were probably in the first couple of weeks after her release. While we've not had any official pick rate data from Behaviour since Krasue's release, Nightlight seems to support this through their unofficial pick rate stats. Krasue is not rock bottom, she's not in the 1% sandpit, with the killers who are cripplingly buggy, unplayably bad, or can't be purchased at all. She still has a lower pick rate than Pig and Trapper, killers with an international reputation for losing games of Dead by Daylight. She's not rock bottom in terms of pick rate, but it is a huge fall off from how dominant she used to be when she came out, even though she is still our newest killer, especially when you realise that most of the unpopular killers have always been unpopular even if they were strong, like Twins or Houndmaster. Krasue started out with a really high pick rate, but fell off extremely quickly. A sub 2% pick rate is what you'd expect from a killer like Knight, Clown or Unknown, originals who've been out for a few years. Not our newest release. This is particularly remarkable when you realise that Myers, a killer who got reworked on the same patch Krasue released on, has experienced a massive resurgence in play rate, to the point he's actually overtaken Kaneki and Springtrap to sit at the top of Nightlight's play rate tables. Admittedly, part of that is definitely down to him being about to be, exiled from the fog entirely, but his pick rate was sky high before this was even announced. It was really remarkable to see these two killers undergoing such different trajectories, Michael being absurdly popular while Krasue gets all but forgotten. I'm not even the only person who's noticed this. I asked my audience on Twitter and YouTube back in November about how often they saw the Krasue in their matches, and the overwhelming majority of respondents on both platforms said they rarely if ever saw her. And Scott Junn made a video in December talking about how Krasue's presence in matches has completely tanked.
Now, when she came out, she had like a 25% pick rate. Normally, we see like a 19 to 20-ish% pick rate for the new killer, but we had like a 25% pick rate for Krasue, and her kill rate, which I wish I had the screenshot for now. Nightlight doesn't go that far back anymore, but it was like 65, 66%, which is significantly higher than every other killer in the game. Nowadays, Krasue sits at a measly 1.6% pick rate, making her one of the least played killers in the entire game, and this basically happened within the span of a month.
Side note, by the way, I just know as soon as I make this video that there'll be this, one guy in my comments who'll be all like, "You ripped off Scott Junn, you bastard!" But I did start work on this script and made my polls about it back in late November, so to that I say we're just two people who noticed the same phenomenon happening at more or less the same time. I just have a longer production cycle. Much longer, it's fucking January. So I thought today might be a good time to piece together why that's the case. We all know why Skull Merchant or Twins or Houndmaster don't see any play, but Krasue is still so new that I'm not sure she's properly understood at the moment. Let's see if we can't change that, shall we? And break down why exactly Krasue seems to not really be resonating with that many players, and whether that could change in the future, or even if it should. Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers, to the Krasue, the killer that everyone seems to have already forgotten. Let's kick off by talking about the context in which she was released, because the past year has been a particularly odd period for new killer releases across the board. 2025 is the first year in DBD history to have only 3 killers released instead of the usual 4, but the two that came out earlier in the year were two of the most popular killers, arguably the two most popular killers ever made. Springtrap was always going to be a smash hit just from the name. FNAF was such an in-demand license that he would see play literally no matter what he did or how strong his power was, and Kaneki also comes from a well-regarded license, while having a power pretty much built to be easy, strong, and broadly compelling, but we will get into that later. The two were enormous hits, and the same goes for the recent rework to Michael Myers that came on the same patch that Krasue did. Myers has always been a fan favourite, a killer that players have loved the idea of but have been frustrated about how bad he was for almost a decade straight, so a rework to a killer that loads of players already have and wanted to be stronger was also hugely popular, even if that rework had and still has its detractors who think slaughtering Stripe feels like a character assassination. But be that as it may, the numbers don't lie. Myers' rework was broadly well liked, and meant that Krasue had more and more she had to do to get out of the shadow cast by the year's licensed content, and that was not going to be easy, because she was also in the shadow of one of the most cooked PTBs we've ever had. 9.2.0 was a PTB that was up there with the Twins rework a couple of years ago as one of the most fucked up test builds ever unleashed upon this game. The patch included crippling punishments for killers taking more or less any game action that might result in them winning. It gave high tier killers like Spirit and Singularity base kit information and slowdown that they did not need, and it included the palette density update that's made playing Killer a slog since it slipped to live. The mood around the Walking Dead chapter was grim, but the Sinister Grace PTB turned that into outright panic and revulsion that behaviour would annihilate the balance of their game so completely, that they thought Survivor, a role that's been very strong for quite some time already, needed so many powerful and intrusive tools. The mood was despondent, even after they confirmed that the anti-everything changes weren't coming to life, and that meant that the Krasue wound up as almost a background detail in her own release patch, because the Myers rework, palette density update, and scrapped anti-everything features were sucking up all the air in the room. And thanks to 9.1.0, everything was still really buggy. It was hard to be enthusiastic about a killer releasing when the entire game was going up in smoke all at once. Perhaps in an attempt to revitalise interest in the killer, Behaviour decided Krasue needed some buff between PTB and Live to give her a bit of extra punch, and get people excited to play her. Okay, that's a lot of extra punch. Guys, that might be a bit too much punch. Guys? Guys? When the 9.2.0 live patch dropped, Krasue was fucking absurd. The buffs she'd gotten had done way too much. Her headform pallet vault, lack of collision during her dash, the extra charges on headlong flight, the instant cancel into M1 from regurgitate. There was just so much bullshit she could do, and she could do it very consistently without a lot of skill from the killer required, or much the survivors could do about it, especially if she relentlessly tunneled off hook due to hook removal not removing your infection. She was utterly insane, especially for the first week of her release, and that's been the closest she's ever come to being genuinely popular, because as it turns out, winning games a lot is a really good way to become very popular very quickly. Of course, this level of power didn't last. She got nerfed hard and fast because the complaints were extremely vocal, and they were right to be. Krasue's 9.2.0 state was a complete abomination. I straight up refused to play her during that first week because it was just that obscene. And while the first round of nerfs was definitely welcome, it wasn't until the second round in 9.2.2 that the killer felt reasonable to go against. And unfortunately, that was also the patch that saw Krasue's presence in matches fall off the face of the planet. Looking back on it, it very much seemed like being busted was the one thing that kept Krasue relevant to most killer players, and here is the million-dollar question. Why was that strength the only thing keeping her relevant? Other killers have released in overtuned states and been brought back into line before. Kaneki, Dracula and Chucky were all nerfed a bit after their release, and yet have maintained play rates that are at least decent, and at best still insanely high. So why couldn't Krasue pull this off? That, to me, is the most important question, because these other killers, her 9.2.0 release state, all of that's in the past. But the way the killer plays today will determine her future for the long term, and understanding why she's fallen off as hard as she has will be key to making the changes that she might get in the future work. And to start with, I think there's this perception that the nerfs made her weaker than she is. Of course, she got a lot of nerfs in the last couple of patches, but that's because she was far too strong, and strong characters getting nerfed is entirely normal, unless they're Blight.
You can't keep getting away with it!
she's still very, very good. Her chase is better than the average killer with a lethality of head form, and her mobility is very good too with headlong flight. She's got a lot of the strength that killers need to be effective at high levels of play. She's not bad by any means, but it didn't stop a lot of people who played Krasue when she came out from feeling discouraged to continue. The people who were playing her for the easy wins dropped her like a stone, and the people who liked the character for what she was still found themselves worse off. The gameplay she enjoyed just felt worse than it did before, and as much as that was good for the game's health, it still feels bad to be on the receiving end of it, especially because of how she got nerfed. Most of Krasue's nerfs were number adjustments, increases to how long various actions took to turn down her efficiency and give survivors more wiggle room against her. Her vault time, stun time, whip collision time, switch time, whip and regurgitate wind-up times, regurgitate cooldown times, all of these got their numbers nerfed, some by a little, some by a lot. And all of these did their job of making Krasue's power have a little bit more give for the survivors going against it, but it also made the killer feel quite clunky a lot of the time, especially if you played her before the nerfs and had gotten used to the old animations and timings for things. She was a character whose animations and general game feel were built around her numbers being similar to what they were on PTB or just after she hit the live servers. Behaviour did not go out designing her with the intent for her to feel clunky as shit. She got made that way because it was the only way they could reasonably bring her power level down. But in doing so, her animations feel terrible. Her power's limitations come from inefficiencies in areas where she was not designed to be inefficient. That feels like ass to play with, especially if you played her when she did feel good. And it compounds with another problem that she has, which is the difference between the Krasue's skill expression and the threshold required to understand her. Krasue is not a difficult killer to pick up and play. Her mechanics are pretty simple, and her gameplay is a flowchart that's fairly easy to follow. Infect a survivor, go head form, catch up with headlong flight, hit them twice, job done. You might think then that this would make her appealing to newer players, but Krasue released in a year where every killer is appealing to new players. Springtrap, Kaneki, and the new Mayas all have low skill floors, but also have a couple of assets Krasue doesn't have that appeal to new players. They are licensed, meaning they might be why that new player picked the game up in the first place, and their abilities all have a high level of immediate feedback when used correctly and intuitively. Put the bite mark on a survivor, they get injured, and you get stronger. That just feels intuitive. Throw the axe and hit someone, they get injured, you see them, you move a bit quicker. Again, it's very intuitive from the first time you use that power. For Krasue, you infect someone with Regurgitate, and then what's that actually doing? On its own, basically nothing. At least nothing that you can tell on the killer end. What if you want to use your ability early and pop head form to immediately fly across the map into your first chase as soon as you spawn? Well, your attack doesn't do anything now. You have to switch back to body form, and if you haven't remembered the whole power because you're Johnny New Play and her power description is fucking long as hell, your attack does absolutely nothing, and you might not even know why. On the odd occasion I have seen a Krasue in my matches as Survivor, I've seen more than one just spamming Regurgitate on me when I'm already infected, as if that's going to do something. And that shows that while Krasue is not hard to pick up, she requires a level of understanding and involvement that other new player killers this year just don't demand. So if she's not for the new players, maybe she could be a killer for more experienced players then. And here's where we have another problem. Krasue is a member of a highly saturated killer archetype, competing with some of the game's strongest killers with some of the game's highest skill ceilings. In other words, the perfect killers for the game's more experienced players. And she doesn't really offer anything that those killers don't. I'll talk about this more later, but Krasue's skill ceiling is not particularly high. She's not a clip farming killer like Billy or Blight, and that means that she's too much of an initial barrier of understanding for brand new players, but not enough depth to satisfy the experienced no-lifers. On the topic of Krasue's depth being a bit lower than it needs to be, there's one more nerf I want to talk about. The only nerf that wasn't just number reductions was a change to the infection system, where you lose your infection completely off hook, which did make sense in the context of tunneling because it made Krasue an absolutely absurd tunneler. She could hit somebody off hook to eat their base BT, catch up to them immediately with headlong flight, and then down them with intestinal whip, leading to an immediate tunnel out due to headform's absurd lethality and mobility. But this came with an unforeseen consequence that made Krasue far more unappealing to play. The whole mushroom management macro play angle, the most unique part of Krasue's power, just does not really matter anymore, because now every hook is effectively a mushroom. Before the nerf, you were encouraged to get a couple of infections in body form before switching to head form, because doing so would deplete the survivor's ability to access mushrooms. Because the person you're chasing and the person you left infected will both need a mushroom at some point. You've given them access to one mushroom, but the survivors need two, so they might have to wait for new ones to spawn or travel across the map to find one, and keep their infection at bay. This rewarded you for playing smart, being economical with your switches and getting the most out of body form, because you forced survivors off gens to get mushrooms, or got to keep lingering infections to save time later. But none of this matters anymore. If you infect two people and switch to head form to chase one of them, the person you left will just take the mushroom that you dropped, and the person that you down will have their infection removed off the hook. So the outcome is the same as if you just left the first person healthy and immediately entered a head form chase as soon as you got your first infection. Right now, there's very little point to splitting your infection anymore, because the survivors effectively have 8 free mushrooms stored in their hook stages, so it's almost always a better use of your time to immediately switch to head form as soon as you get the first infection, because any extra mushrooms you leave behind likely aren't going to matter anyway. Hell, if you just play infect head down hook the entire game, the mushroom mechanic becomes almost entirely irrelevant, because the only people you're going to be infecting will be the ones that you're chasing, who do not have time to grab a mushroom before you hit them. If you value killer macro play and managing survivor resources, there was a legitimately appealing reason to pick up the Krasue, but the side effect of the tunnel reduction nerf is that none of this matters anymore. Removing your infection is so easy that mushrooms are almost an optional mechanic these days. This leaves the primary appeal entirely in her chase powers, which, as you already covered, don't have that much depth and got made significantly clunkier with the nerfs, so that feels worse to use as well. And that leads me onto the biggest issue that Krasue has with her power design: her identity crisis, because not only does her power now feel clunky to use, the actual chase interactions are extremely derivative of other killers that we've seen before, to the point that it becomes hard to justify picking her at all over those other killers. If you want cut-offs in a pallet vault, Kaneki does that with more depth, gets a free injury from it, and at least after Krasue's nerf, he's also stronger and easier than her. If you want an infection killer, Plague is the definitive infection killer, with a far more developed infection system and actual macro play decisions that she's not punished for. If you want the intestinal whip, more or less every killer released from Chucky has a short range dash attack that slides around obstacles. You can't move around behaviour head officers without tripping over these powers. Hell, if you really want a killer who has to infect you first before they can damage you with a mid-range whip attack, Nemesis is right there. He's bloody huge, it is not like he's easy to miss. In any case, all of these killers provide viable alternatives to Krasue's power that do a lot of the same things that she does, but done with more depth or less clunkiness, even if the killer as a whole is weaker. This doesn't necessarily mean that Krasue will always be unappealing. There are definitely still, some Krasue players out there after all, but it means that there's a load of very good reasons not to play her, or at least to play other killers instead. Anybody who's watched my videos for a decent amount of time will know one of my biggest issues with modern DBD is killer powers becoming homogenized, the dash slop phenomenon, where behaviour is continually trying to recycle the same power elements over and over and over again to continually produce safe, powerful designs that will find an audience instead of taking a risk on something more unique. Krasue is exactly what I was always worried about, that continuously, regurgitating the same design has a limited shelf life and will result in new killers struggling to find a home, as their design space bumps against pre-existing killers with their own established player bases. Say what you like about my taste in killers, but I've always loved killers like Skull Merchant, Twins, Houndmaster and Plague, because they are completely unique. Nothing else plays like them. There is no killer in DBD that expresses skill in the same way Merchant does through her macro play and beam control. Literally, no one does it like her. Same with the Twins. No killer expresses what it is to be in two places at once as completely as Twins. No killer manages health states the same way that Plague does. And Houndmaster has all the mechanical depth of a high skill ceiling dash killer, except it's expressed in a wholly different way with new benefits, techniques and drawbacks. Again, nobody else does it like these ladies. And even if it means those killers might have niche player bases, it means the people who play them absolutely love them, because they enrich their experience with the game in a way no other killer could even come close to replicating. It will be harder to find that one Krasue guy than it was to find that one Skull Merchant guy, or that one Twins girl, or that one Houndmaster guy, or that one Knight girl, or even that one Trickster deer, because there's simply less reason to pick Krasue over other killers, and as new killers come out with flashier and flashier powers, or just bigger and bigger licenses, her pick rate is only liable to go down over time. Every time a big new chapter drops, most commonly but not always a license these days, the pick rates of everything else will drop at least a bit, as players try out the new hotness and sometimes those numbers just don't go back up again. And I suspect once Henry drops later in the month, Krasue's pick rate is going to take a hit. Who knows whether or not it's going to go back up. If it doesn't go back up again, and Behaviour sees the lack of popularity for their newest original killer as a problem, then I do not envy the poor fuckers in live design who are assigned to solve that problem, because Krasue is not a killer that you can just buff. Behaviour has a history of buffing killers who are already strong, just because they're underplayed or feel awkward. This happened to Singularity a few years ago. He was a good killer that got buffed because his skill floor was so high that a lot of players are put off of playing him. But looking back on it, I hate to say it, but this plan kind of backfired. A year on from those buffs, Singularity's become absolutely insufferable to go against. They made him so easy to play that some of his former mains have stopped playing him because he's too brain dead, and his pick rate is as low as it was back then, so these changes didn't even address the problem Behaviour was setting out to solve. It's happened on smaller scales too, to Hillbilly and Blight. Who remembers when they made Billy the best killer in the game in a random bug fix patch for a few months, or when they removed Shredded Notes' downside for no reason whatsoever? And who can forget the most egregious case of buffing a killer who was already strong just to make a number go up? The Twins rework, which made one of the worst abominations the game has ever seen in the name of driving up a killer's popularity. Hell, we've already seen what Krasue will do when she's fully let off the leash. Do we really want Farmer Jones to come back? The Krasue is not a killer that can simply be buffed to improve her play rate, and Behaviour has to know this, because we've seen what she's like when her numbers are good. She becomes the best killer in Dead by Daylight, and completely demolishes the survivor experience. Krasue in her current state can't really be much stronger than she is without feeling like a fucking mistake. So what she needs instead is something more like a mini rework. Think of what Knight and Freddy got over the past couple of years. Both these killers were not as good as they could have been and had very limited appeal, but their kits didn't really have enough room for just some straight buffs, so their existing mechanics were fleshed out to give them more depth and a more defined identity. Krasue's very straightforward kit is both a source of her feeling bland and uninspired to play, but also makes her hard to balance, because all you can do is change her numbers, and changing those numbers just a little bit can be the difference between making her miserable to play and impossible to play against. The solution to both these problems is to give her a bit more depth, a bit more stuff for her to do that is unique to her, and I've had some ideas that I'd like to pitch to you about how that could be done. Before I go into my suggested changes to give Krasue a bit more going on, a more concrete mechanic identity and enough room in her kit to have her numbers feel good but not oppressive, there's one more question we have to answer. Why should we care? Behaviour has a habit recently of leaving its original characters in the dust. Look at how unloved Houndmaster has been since she came out in late 2023. Or on a broader scale, characters like Twins and Hag, who spent years and years being left behind, or Trickster and Skull Merchant, killers who've been left for years in the rework freezer, waiting for Behaviour to get round to them. Why should we expect Krasue to be any different? Well, aside from the fact that these killers also need some love, mostly in the form of bug fixes, Krasue represents a fairly unique opportunity because a power like hers should by all rights be more popular than it is. Houndmaster and Twins and Hag and whatnot don't get love because their powers and other elements of their design will inherently have a niche appeal. But Krasue has a dash power, something which will inherently draw players in. By all accounts, she should be decently popular, she should be well liked, but for one reason or another, she is just not. And unlike a lot of these niche killers, the discontent most people have for her is limited pretty much entirely to her power being the way it is. Her model, her animations, her music and design, her approach to folklore, they're all brilliant and widely appreciated even by people who do not like actually playing the Krasue. I even rate her lore pretty highly. In every aspect of her design, other than her power, Krasue is a smash hit waiting to happen, and her power being so bland is the only thing stopping her from becoming the next Unknown or Dredge as a new fan favourite original killer. It would be a missed opportunity not to capitalise on that by prioritising her for a mini rework and turning the Krasue into something really special, to give the people who want to love the Krasue as a character a reason to actually play her. To that end, I have 3 recommended changes that I would make to Krasue to give her that unique mechanical identity, to give her more moving parts so that her numbers can be more easily tuned, and give people a reason to pick her over the other dash killers. I've run this past a couple of Krasue fans in my community and they really like them. Shout out to my wonderful Patreon supporter Pole Vaulter for her help, so tell me what you think. Step 1. With the exception of Regurgitate cooldown adjustments, all her numbers are reverted back to her release date. This feels like a necessary step to get Krasue back to feeling good to play again. She was designed around her animations and action speeds feeling better than they were, and it feels dreadful whenever you use the pallet vault or get stunned in head form, and you can practically feel the nerfs affecting you in real time. You can count the extra fractions of a second added on to every single interaction. It just feels dreadful. Admittedly, if this was the only change I was suggesting, it would be awful for her balance. She'd be back to her release top 1 to 3 nightmare status, but it is not because of the new features I've added to the rest of her kit, to give her more points of interaction and make her power more limited in terms of what it can do and when it can do it. So step 2, we're adding a new effect to Regurgitate. Regurgitate now applies Leeched to pallets it's used on, as well as survivors. Leeched pallets become rotten pallets after 10 seconds. While in head form, the killer can vault rotten pallets, but only rotten pallets. Survivors can remove the leech status effect from particular pallets by using a mushroom on it, which will remove the rotten status after 20 seconds. This change is meant to solve 2 problems that Krasue has had since the second round of her nerfs hit. The removal of the infection off hook, meaning the mushroom mechanic is basically redundant, and the pallet vault, which has been nerfed enough to feel bad to use, while still feeling bad to go against. The Krasue using Regurgitate to manually infect resources ahead of time is already a mechanic integrated into a couple of her add-ons, and it alludes to an extra level of depth that her base kit does not have. Making the Scamper only work on pallets that you manually infect would allow the Scamper to feel powerful when it's used, without making every pallet just death simulator for the survivors, because it would be fairly clearly communicated to both players which pallets can be vaulted and which ones can't. It would encourage Krasue to spend lots of time in body form at the start of the match to plan out where she wants to take her chasers, which pallets can be played without needing to scamper them, and which need to be made rotten before taking the chase there. It would be a completely unique dynamic to her. Kind of like Plague infecting gens early in the game to control the map better. Krasue would be infecting pallets early in the game to control her later chasers better. And integrating mushrooms into the intended counterplay would reward survivors for learning which pallets are strongest against the head form, since they can burn mushrooms to keep that pallet safe. It would give mushrooms a use in a world where you lose your infection so easily, and would encourage the Krasue to spend more time in body form earlier in the game, not to just infect the pallets, but to infect survivors and make them choose between cleansing themselves of their infection or using them to cleanse the pallets instead. And my third suggestion is adding a new effect to Intestinal Whip. Let's call it Intestinal Grip. When Intestinal Whip hits a leeched survivor, the survivor is not immediately damaged. Instead, the intestines wrap around the survivor's body for 2.5 seconds. During this time, the survivor maintains full control over their own movement, but can't interact with anything. The killer becomes attached to the survivor during this time, and can aim that survivor towards an object in the environment. Press the attack button again to drag the survivor in a straight line at 14 meters a second for 0.75 seconds. A survivor being dragged this way can use their movement inputs to attempt to swerve the course of the drag. Colliding with a solid object, including another survivor, will inflict a health state of damage to the gripped survivor as the Krasue bites the survivor and takes a chunk out of their neck. Survivors or pallets hit by a gripped survivor become leeched. Leeched survivors hit by a gripped survivor lose a health state. Leeched or rotten pallets hit by a gripped survivor will break on impact. Okay, this is easily the most radical change I'm going to suggest here, but hear me out. Intestinal Whip being the way it is, as the primary way Krasue will get most of her health states, is really fucking boring. Whether or not you like mechanically complex dash killers, Obviously, I'll rag on the dash slop conglomerate any day of the week, but I don't see the people who are landing crazy clips with Kaneki or Wesker getting that same value out of Intestinal Whip. It just doesn't do anything that the other dash killers don't do better, so giving it a secondary condition to deal with that health state not only gives the killer room to get buffed, but also gives her something to do that the other kids on the block aren't doing. And the key, I thought, was in the fact that the flying head is uniquely smaller than the survivors it's hitting. Dealing a health state by basically flinging your intestines at the survivor works, I guess, but it's a bit uninspired and doesn't really fit with the fantasy of a floating, possessed head hungering for flesh. Having it instead grab you, drag you around and take a bite out of you would feel way more visceral for a killer characterised by visceral meaty goriness, and it would give the dash more unique points of interaction too. The survivor changing their position once the head is attached to try and force the killer to drop them, and the killer can try and compensate for that by finding sneaky places to slam the survivor into. It obviously does cut a little bit from Wesker's cloth, with a dash designed to smash the survivor into the terrain, but the mechanics of controlling and countering it would be very different and give you a reason to play the Krasue over Wesker sometimes, and the other dash killers by extension. And a good Krasue might be able to use it even more effectively than her current dash attack, because this version adds way more risk to Krasue's primary counterplay, body blocking head form while uninfected. If survivors could have their infection spread by being slammed into another survivor, suddenly body blocking a Krasue becomes a dangerous affair, because if you do it properly, the Krasue would become just as powerless to continue their chase as they are right now. But if the Krasue can anticipate this and play around you doing this, both survivors could easily become infected at once, and the Krasue now has the opportunity to snowball off this pressure in head form or create dead zones by slamming survivors into rotten pallets. Can you see now how this version of the dash attack has just more going on? The survivor being chased now has a totally unique mechanic to wrangle with, if they want to avoid getting hit. The Krasue now has to think about where they'll whip the survivor in the best spot to guarantee a health state, and prospective protectors trying to body block the killer or additional risk of collateral damage if they try to interfere in the chase. Truth be told, I don't know whether this is a version of the Krasue that I would necessarily play personally. At the end of the day, I'm a man drawn to the weirdo powers in DBD. I don't know if this version of Krasue would scratch that itch, but I'm confident it would at least drive more people to try her out. The fundamentals of her power, going back to having decent numbers, might win back some of the crowd who dropped her after the nerfs hit, while adding new mechanics and forms of skill expression to her kit that might generate new interest without risking putting her existing player base off of her, because nothing's really changed that much. Krasue is a killer with an enormous amount of potential. She represents a rich culture and folklore that turned heads and stomachs alike when it was announced, and the Sinister Grace chapter is an earmark of original quality in an era dominated by licensed content. Krasue is almost the perfect original, but fails at the final and arguably most important hurdle, a power that brings the character to life in a satisfying and unique way. For a variety of reasons, she's never quite been able to fulfill that promise, with her mechanic identity mostly just being busted and then being forgotten once she got nerfed. But the time will come when Krasue will be looked into again for future polish or changes. I hope when that time comes that Behaviour has the resources and the ambition to make her as good as she can be, to invest a bit more into her, to create a killer who lives up to the fantasy and feels like a part of the roster that really stands out from the crowd. But before that happens, we've got another East Asian original female killer who needs Behaviour's attention first. Oh baby, do I have some words to say about the buffs that you just got. They're mostly good, don't worry about it.